I found divorce papers hidden in my husband's desk drawer. But it wasn't the divorce that broke my heart. It was what else I discovered that night. Hi, I'm Lauren Mitchell. I'm 34, a pediatric nurse here in Portland, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage. Ryan and I met during my nursing school clinicals. He was this charming medical billing consultant who brought coffee to the night shift nurses and actually listened when we talked about our patients. When he proposed 2 years later, my grandmother Grace squeezed my hand and whispered, "Honey, that boy looks at you like you hung the moon." I should have trusted my instincts when that look started to fade. It began with little things. Ryan working later, taking mysterious phone calls in the garage, asking strange questions about my work. When my Aunt Sarah passed away 6 months ago and left me her medical practice, worth about $800,000, Ryan's interest in my career suddenly intensified. Then came that Tuesday night in February that changed everything. I was looking for patient files in our shared home office when I saw papers tucked behind Ryan's computer monitor. My heart stopped when I recognized the legal letterhead, divorce papers, with my name on them. But here's what made my blood turn to ice. Scattered across his desk were practice sheets, pages and pages of traced signatures from my hospital's pediatric cancer ward. My husband had been forging children's signatures. I sat there in our kitchen chair, staring at evidence that the man I'd loved for 8 years was planning to not just leave me, but steal from dying children to do it. That's when my phone rang. It was my mom, calling for our weekly check-in. "Honey, you sound upset," she said immediately. "What's wrong?" I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Mom, remember what Grandma Grace always told us about trusting our gut?" "Of course, sweetheart. When something feels wrong, it usually is." What if the person you trusted most was the one you should trust least? There was a pause. Then Mom said something that gave me the strength to do what came next. "Lauren, protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Your grandmother would want you to be smart, not sorry." That night, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney. By Friday morning, every penny of my inheritance was safely transferred to the Children's Hospital Trust Fund, the same hospital whose patients Ryan had been practicing to forge. The second call was to my best friend Sarah Chen, a pediatric oncologist who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about missing treatment funds. 2 weeks later, Ryan filed those divorce papers, confident he'd get half of everything. When he discovered the money was gone, he tried to withdraw the filing. But by then, I'd uncovered something that made our marriage problems look insignificant. Because I'd discovered that Ryan hadn't just been planning to steal from me. He'd already been stealing from the most vulnerable patients in our hospital, and the amount missing was enough to cost children their lives. That's when I realized this wasn't about divorce anymore. This was about justice. The hardest part wasn't discovering my husband's betrayal, it was realizing how long I'd been blind to it. Looking back, the signs had been there for months. Ryan's sudden fascination with my work schedule, the way he'd linger when I mentioned difficult cases, his newfound interest in hospital policies. What I'd mistaken for supportive curiosity was actually reconnaissance. Our marriage had started like something out of a romance novel. Ryan would surprise me with my favorite lavender tea after brutal 12-hour shifts, listen to me cry about losing patients, and hold me when the weight of pediatric oncology felt too heavy. He understood that my calling wasn't just a job, it was a mission inherited from the women who raised me. My grandmother Grace had been a nurse during World War II, caring for wounded soldiers with nothing but determination and prayer. She'd taught my mother the importance of healing others, and Mom had passed that legacy to me. Nursing isn't what you do, sweetheart, Mom always said. It's who you are. Ryan had seemed to honor that sacred part of my identity. When Aunt Sarah died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving me her thriving pediatric practice, Ryan had been my rock through the grief. Sarah had been more than my father's sister. She'd been my mentor, the woman who'd encouraged me to specialize in pediatric care. Her final gift, that $800,000 inheritance, felt like validation of everything she'd taught me about putting children first. Sarah would be so proud, Ryan had whispered at the funeral, holding me as I sobbed. You're going to do amazing things with this opportunity. 3 months later, those words felt like mockery. The money had changed something in Ryan, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when. His medical billing consultancy had been struggling. Healthcare was moving toward automated systems, and independent consultants were becoming obsolete. But instead of discussing our financial concerns like we always had, Ryan became secretive about money. He started handling our taxes alone, asking detailed questions about my inheritance that felt more like an audit than spousal interest. Then came the hospital incidents that should have alarmed me sooner. Ryan had begun visiting me at work more frequently, bringing coffee for the entire pediatric oncology staff. Everyone loved him. The nurses called him our coffee angel, and even Dr. Chen remarked how lucky I was to have such a supportive husband. But during those visits, Ryan would ask odd questions about billing procedures, insurance protocols, and patient documentation processes. Just trying to understand your world better, he'd say when I questioned his curiosity. The night shift nurses mentioned seeing him wandering the halls after hours, claiming he was looking for me even when I wasn't scheduled to work. Security footage later revealed he'd been photographing patient charts and billing documents with his phone. My colleague Maria had tried to warn me. Lauren, honey, something feels off about Ryan's visits, she'd said during a break. Yesterday, I caught him looking through files at the nurses' station. When I asked what he needed, he got all flustered and said he was just interested in hospital operations. Pride had made me defensive. He's a medical billing consultant, Maria. Of course he's interested in how hospitals function. But Maria's expression had stayed worried. Just keep your eyes open, okay? The patients Ryan had been targeting were the most heartbreaking cases. Children whose families were already drowning in medical debt. Kids whose treatment required experimental procedures not fully covered by insurance. These families trusted our hospital with their children's lives, never imagining someone was systematically stealing from the funds designated for their care. Little Tommy Rodriguez, 7 years old with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, needed a cutting-edge treatment that cost $30,000. His mother worked double shifts at a diner to afford the copays, bringing homemade cookies to thank the staff who were helping save her son's life. Emma Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, was a 9-year-old artist who drew pictures of butterflies for every nurse on the ward. Her family had mortgaged their house to pay for her brain tumor treatment. These weren't just medical files to me. They were children whose laughter filled our halls, whose courage inspired me every single day, whose families had become part of our hospital family. And Ryan had been scaling their futures. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who apologized 3 times for ruining my day off. Ryan had timed it perfectly. He was already at work when the doorbell rang, leaving me to face this alone in my pajamas with my morning coffee growing cold. The legal document felt surreal in my hands. All those formal phrases about irreconcilable differences and equitable distribution of marital assets. But there, highlighted in yellow marker, was the line that revealed his true motivation, a detailed inventory of my inheritance, down to the exact dollar amount. He'd calculated everything, The medical practice valuation, projected annual income, even the antique medical equipment Aunt Sarah had collected over 40 years. Ryan had turned my grief into a spreadsheet. What he hadn't calculated was my midnight discovery 3 weeks earlier. When Ryan came home that evening, his performance was Oscar-worthy. He found me sitting at our kitchen table, divorce papers spread before me like evidence of a crime. "Lauren, sweetheart, we need to talk," he began, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "This isn't what I wanted, but we've grown apart. You're so focused on work, on those kids at the hospital. We never talk anymore." The irony was breathtaking. Here was the man who'd been systematically stealing from those same children, playing the victim of neglect. "You want half of Sarah's inheritance." The words came out steadier than felt possible. Ryan's rehearsed expression flickered for just a moment. "It's only fair, honey. We're married. Oregon is a community property state, and Sarah left that money to me, specifically to me, for continuing her legacy of pediatric care. But legally, since we acquired it during our marriage, we didn't acquire anything, Ryan. Sarah died, and she chose to trust me with her life's work." That night, Ryan slept in the guest room to give us both space to think. But through the thin walls, phone conversations leaked through, hushed, urgent discussions about asset recovery and legal timelines. Someone was coaching him, feeding him strategies. The next morning brought Ryan's first tactical error. Over breakfast, he attempted tenderness. "Maybe we don't have to go through with this," he said, reaching for my hand across the table. "Perhaps we could work things out, see a counselor, fight for our marriage." But his fingers were shaking, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool March morning. This wasn't a man reconsidering divorce. This was panic. "What changed your mind so suddenly?" "Nothing changed. Everything changed. You transferred the money, didn't you?" The accusation hung between us like a blade. Ryan's mask had slipped completely, revealing the calculation beneath his supposed heartbreak. "How did you know about the transfer?" His face went ashen. I just assumed you might do something like that. You're smart about protecting yourself." But Ryan had revealed too much. Someone had been monitoring my financial accounts, tracking my attorney's actions. The divorce filing wasn't spontaneous marital discord. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign with inside information. "Who told you about the trust fund, Ryan?" "Nobody told me anything. I'm your husband. I know how you think." The lies were unraveling faster than he could construct them. That afternoon, while Ryan attended a client meeting that I suspected was actually damage control with his legal team, Dr. Chen called with news that made everything click into place. "Lauren, we need to meet, today, away from the hospital." We sat in her car in the parking lot of Powell's Books, a location chosen for its anonymity among Portland's literary crowds. "The financial audit discovered something disturbing," Sarah said, her voice clinical in the way doctors use when delivering devastating news. "Treatment funds have been systematically diverted from pediatric oncology accounts, small amounts over several months, always from families with the most complex insurance situations. The numbers were staggering. 37 families affected, over $300,000 missing. Money designated for experimental treatments, medication copays, and equipment that directly impacted survival rates. The thefts required intimate knowledge of our billing systems and patient financial profiles," Sarah continued. "Someone with administrative access who understood exactly which accounts to target for maximum impact with minimal immediate detection." Ryan's hospital visits suddenly made horrifying sense. His questions about billing procedures, his wandering through restricted areas, his photographing of patient files. It hadn't been supportive curiosity. It had been reconnaissance for the most sophisticated theft imaginable. There's more, Lauren. The timeline suggests the stealing accelerated dramatically after your aunt's inheritance became public knowledge. Whoever did this was preparing for something big. That evening, Ryan returned home with flowers and takeout from our favorite restaurant, playing the role of hopeful reconciliation. But when he suggested we talk about our future and maybe reconsider some recent financial decisions, the manipulation became crystal clear. The divorce filing had never been about ending our marriage. It had been about accessing my inheritance before his crimes were discovered. And time was running out for both of us. Evidence has a way of revealing itself once you know where to look, and Sarah Chen had been looking for months. Meeting her in secret felt like something from a spy novel, but the reality was far more heartbreaking. Sarah had compiled a folder thick with financial discrepancies, patient account irregularities, and timeline correlations that painted a devastating picture. Each document represented a family whose hope had been monetized by someone they'd trusted. The pattern became clear 3 weeks ago, Sarah explained, spreading papers across her dining room table like a detective's crime board. Small diversions from accounts belonging to families with the most complex insurance situations, cases where a few $1,000s missing might not be immediately noticed. The Rodriguez family had been charged for Tommy's experimental treatment, but the funds never reached the pharmaceutical company. Emma Chen's brain tumor surgery required specialized equipment that was ordered but never arrived, forcing delays that could have cost her life. The Patterson twins, born premature with respiratory complications, had families scrambling to cover costs for treatments that should have been funded by money already stolen. Whoever did this understood our vulnerabilities perfectly, Sarah continued. They knew which families were already stretched thin, which accounts had the most complicated approval processes, and exactly when to strike for maximum impact with minimal immediate detection. The sophistication was chilling. Ryan's access through his consulting work had given him administrative passwords, billing system knowledge, and most importantly, the trust of staff who saw him as my supportive husband rather than a predator stalking their most vulnerable patients. Sarah's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. The theft had been escalating. What started as small diversions had grown bolder as Ryan's confidence increased. Recent transactions showed larger amounts being redirected from multiple families simultaneously, suggesting either growing desperation or preparation for a final massive theft. The sophistication was chilling. Ryan's access through his consulting work had given him administrative passwords, billing system knowledge, and most importantly, the trust of staff who saw him as my supportive husband rather than a predator stalking their most vulnerable patients. Sarah's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. The theft had been escalating. What started as small diversions had grown bolder as Ryan's confidence increased. Recent transactions showed larger amounts being redirected from multiple families simultaneously, suggesting either growing desperation or preparation for a final massive theft. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Security footage from the past 2 months shows Ryan in areas of the hospital where he had no legitimate business. The pediatric records room, the financial aid office, even the pharmacy billing department after hours. The images on her laptop were damning. Ryan moving through hospital corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged there, using his keycard access, privileges extended to him because of our marriage, to enter restricted areas. In one particularly clear shot, he was photographing patient files with his phone, his face showing the focused concentration of someone executing a well-planned operation. But the most devastating revelation came when Sarah pulled up Ryan's consulting contract with the hospital. His official role was limited to billing optimization for the general medical wards, with no authorized access to pediatric oncology accounts. Every transaction, every file access, every moment he'd spent in our department had been unauthorized criminal activity. The audit trail suggests he's been using your credentials too, Sarah said gently. Your login appeared on financial transactions during times when you were verifiably working patient care. He must have been watching you enter passwords or had access to your work computer at home. The violation felt personal in ways that transcended the clinical evidence. Ryan hadn't just stolen from sick children. He'd used my identity, my reputation, my years of dedicated service as cover for his crimes. Colleagues who trusted me had unknowingly enabled his access because they assumed his presence meant my endorsement. Maria from the night shift had been trying to protect me when she'd mentioned Ryan's suspicious behavior. Other nurses had noticed too, but hesitated to speak up, not wanting to interfere in what they assumed was marital support. Their silence hadn't been negligence. It had been respect for my privacy, exploited by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate hospital culture. We need to involve administration immediately, Sarah urged, and probably law enforcement. This isn't just internal theft, it's fraud involving federal healthcare funds and endangered patient lives. But something else was nagging at the timeline. Ryan's divorce filing had come exactly 3 weeks after the hospital's financial audit was announced. His sudden urgency to access my inheritance wasn't random, it was calculated. He needed that money for something specific, something time-sensitive. Sarah, when is the final audit report due? Her face paled as she checked her calendar. Next Friday, 10 days from now. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Ryan wasn't just stealing treatment funds, he was planning to replace them with my inheritance money before the audit revealed the theft. The divorce was supposed to give him legal access to Sarah's bequest, allowing him to cover his tracks and emerge as a hero who'd helped struggling families by contributing personal funds to their care. It was brilliant, sociopathic, and completely dependent on my cooperation. There's something else we need to discuss, Sarah said, her expression grave. The families affected by this, they don't know yet. Some of them are planning fundraisers to cover costs for treatments they've already paid for. Others are considering going into debt for procedures that should have been funded by stolen money. The human cost was staggering, and Ryan was still at home, playing the role of a heartbroken husband while children's lives hung in the balance. Time to end his performance. Truth has a way of hiding in the most unexpected places, and Ryan's came tumbling out of a casino security report. Sarah's investigation had expanded beyond hospital records into Ryan's personal financial history, revealing a web of deception that made the medical theft look like a symptom rather than the disease. Bank statements showed a pattern of cash withdrawals that corresponded perfectly with visits to Portland's riverboat casinos, visits that had been escalating in frequency and amount over the past 18 months. The gambling started small, Sarah explained, spreading Ryan's credit card statements across her kitchen counter like tarot cards predicting disaster. $50 here, $100 there, but look at this progression. The numbers told a devastating story. What began as occasional entertainment had morphed into a compulsion that consumed entire paychecks. Ryan's consulting business hadn't been struggling because of industry changes. It had been hemorrhaging money into slot machines and poker tables while he covered the losses with increasingly desperate measures. But the timeline revealed something even more heartbreaking. Ryan's gambling addiction had begun shortly after our first wedding anniversary, around the time he'd started accompanying me to hospital events where we met families facing their worst nightmares. Instead of being inspired by their courage, he'd apparently found their stories overwhelming. "There's more," Sarah said quietly, pulling up security footage on her laptop. "The casino provided this after we explained the investigation. They were actually concerned about Ryan's behavior." The video showed a man barely recognizable as my husband, hollow-eyed, desperate, sitting at machines for hours while losing money we couldn't afford. But the timestamps were what made my heart break. Many of these sessions occurred immediately after he'd visited me at work, right after meeting families like the Rodriguezes or the Chens. He was using the hospital visits as emotional preparation for gambling, Sarah observed. The stress of seeing sick children, hearing about treatment costs, watching families struggle, it was triggering his need to escape. The psychological pattern was tragic and infuriating simultaneously. Ryan had been stealing from the very families whose suffering drove him to gamble, creating a vicious cycle where his addiction funded itself through the destruction of others' hope. Hospital security provided the final piece of the puzzle: footage of Ryan in the pediatric oncology billing office at 2:47 a.m. on multiple occasions, using a maintenance access codes he'd somehow obtained. But his behavior in these videos wasn't that of a confident criminal. It was the frantic, shaking desperation of someone in withdrawal, someone who needed just one more score to make everything right. The amounts he stole correlate exactly with his gambling losses, Sarah pointed out. He wasn't getting rich off this. He was feeding an addiction that had completely consumed his judgment. The most devastating revelation came in Ryan's own handwriting, discovered in a notebook hidden in his car. Pages and pages of calculations, family names matched with account numbers, and most chillingly, justifications for each theft written like a manifesto of someone who'd convinced himself he was helping rather than hurting. The Rodriguez family will get their insurance sorted eventually. Tommy is young and strong. He can wait a few more weeks for treatment while I fix my situation. Another note, written in shaky handwriting. Emma's surgery can be delayed. Brain tumors in children often respond better to treatment after they've grown anyway. This money will help me win back everything I've lost, and then I can pay them back with interest. The delusion was complete. Ryan had rewritten reality to cast himself as a temporary borrower rather than a thief, as someone making difficult but ultimately beneficial decisions for families too emotional to think clearly about their children's medical care. But the final entry in his notebook revealed the most terrifying truth of all. Lauren's inheritance will solve everything. One big win at the tables, and every family gets their money back, plus extra. She'll thank me when this is over. Ryan wasn't just planning to steal my inheritance. He was planning to gamble it all on one final bet to fix everything. Confronting someone you love about their addiction feels like performing surgery without anesthesia, necessary but agonizing for everyone involved. Ryan sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same place where we'd shared morning coffee and evening conversations for 8 years. But tonight, Sarah's evidence folder lay between us like a chasm that couldn't be crossed with explanations or apologies. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, his hands trembling as he reached for his water glass. Long enough to protect the inheritance, not long enough to protect those families. The weight of that truth settled over both of us. 37 families had trusted our hospital with their children's lives, never imagining that someone wearing a visitor's badge and carrying coffee for the nursing staff was systematically stealing their hope. "I can explain everything," Ryan began, but his voice cracked on the word everything, as if he finally understood the magnitude of what everything encompassed. "Explain Tommy Rodriguez waiting 3 extra weeks for treatment because you needed poker money? Explain Emma Chen's surgery being delayed because you convinced yourself brain tumors get better with time?" Ryan's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like the man who'd held me through difficult shifts, who'd understood why pediatric nursing was more calling than career. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The gambling, it started as stress relief after visiting you at work. Seeing those kids, hearing their stories, watching their families fall apart financially, I needed something to make the pain stop. The irony was devastating. Ryan's compassion for suffering children had triggered the very addiction that ultimately caused them more suffering. So you decided to solve their financial problems by stealing their money?
That's not how it started. The desperation in his voice was raw, unfiltered. The first time, it was just a small amount from an account that had insurance complications. I told myself it was temporary. I'd win it back at the casino and return it before anyone noticed. But the gambling, it became the only time my mind went quiet. Ryan pulled out his notebook, the same one Sarah had photographed, and opened it to pages covered with calculations and rationalizations. Look at this. I documented everything. Every family, every amount, every plan to pay them back with interest. This wasn't random theft. It was a system to eventually help everyone. The notebook read like the manifesto of someone who'd convinced himself that stealing was generosity, that gambling with children's treatment funds was somehow an investment in their future. Page after page of mental gymnastics designed to transform criminal behavior into heroic sacrifice. And my inheritance? How did that fit into your system of helping people? Ryan's face went pale. The inheritance was going to be the solution. One big bet, using professional poker strategies instead of slot machines. With $800,000, I could win enough to replace everything I'd taken and still have money left over for families who needed additional help. The plan was so delusional, so catastrophically dangerous that it took my breath away. You were going to gamble Aunt Sarah's life savings on poker? Money she left specifically for pediatric care. I researched professional gambling techniques for months, calculated odds, studied player psychology, even took online courses in advanced poker strategy. This wasn't going to be random chance. It was going to be a carefully executed plan to turn your inheritance into enough money to save every child in that hospital. The notebook contained pages of poker statistics, casino research, and betting strategies that Ryan had apparently spent hundreds of hours developing. His addiction hadn't just consumed his judgment, it had convinced him he could master chance itself through sheer determination and mathematical analysis. What about us, Ryan? What about our marriage, our future, the life we'd built together? His tears came then, the kind of weeping that comes from someone finally seeing their reflection clearly after months of delusion. I thought if I could fix everything, make all those families whole again, you'd understand. You'd see that every risk I took was for them, for the children you love so much. The tragedy was that part of his motivation was genuine. Ryan's notebook included detailed research about each stolen family's financial situation, medical prognosis, and treatment timeline. He'd been tracking their progress like a guardian angel, albeit one who'd stolen their wings. "There's something else," Ryan whispered, reaching for another section of the notebook. "Something I've never told you about why the pediatric ward affects me so much." The page he showed me contained a single photograph. A young boy with leukemia, maybe 7 years old, smiling despite the IV lines and hospital gown. The resemblance to Ryan was unmistakable. "My brother Danny, he died when I was 12. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, same as Tommy Rodriguez. Our family went bankrupt paying for his treatment, and he died anyway." Everything clicked into place with heartbreaking clarity. Ryan's addiction wasn't just stress relief. It was complicated grief, survivor's guilt, and the desperate need to rewrite a childhood tragedy where loving someone hadn't been enough to save them. Sometimes the greatest act of love
is refusing to enable the person you're trying to save. Ryan's revelation about his brother Danny had recontextualized everything, but it couldn't erase the reality of what he'd done. 37 families were still missing treatment funds, and the hospital audit was now just 6 days away. Compassion for his childhood trauma couldn't trump the immediate needs of children whose lives hung in the balance. I want to help you, Ryan, but helping you can't mean sacrificing those kids. His face showed a flicker of hope mixed with terror. What if we work together? You understand the billing system better than anyone. We could figure out how to make small transfers over time, spread across different accounts so nothing looks suspicious. Your inheritance is already in a trust. We could use it as collateral for loans to cover the missing funds temporarily. The plan he was proposing would make me complicit in covering up his crimes, transforming my aunt's legacy into a tool for financial manipulation. But Ryan's desperation was so raw, his love for those children so genuine despite his terrible choices, that part of me wanted to find a way to protect everyone. There's another option, came quietly. We could replace the money together, but only after you enter treatment for gambling addiction. Full disclosure to hospital administration, cooperation with any investigation, and restitution to every affected family. Ryan's notebook lay open between us, pages of meticulous planning that had been both his salvation and his damnation. He'd tracked every theft with the precision of someone who genuinely intended to make things right. But addiction had warped his timeline into a fantasy where someday always remained just out of reach. Treatment means admitting I'm a criminal, he whispered. It means losing my consulting license, probably facing charges, definitely losing you. Those families will hate me. The hospital staff who trusted me because of you, they'll feel betrayed. They already are betrayed, Ryan. The question is whether we're going to compound that betrayal with more lies or start the hard work of making it right. His hands shook as he turned through pages of calculations, family photos he'd somehow obtained, and treatment timelines he'd memorized. What about Tommy Rodriguez? His next treatment cycle starts Monday. If the missing funds aren't replaced by then, his family will have to choose between mortgaging their house or delaying potentially life-saving therapy. The manipulation was subtle but devastating. Ryan was using the urgency of Tommy's situation to pressure me into enabling his cover-up scheme. But something in his voice suggested this wasn't entirely calculated. His concern for Tommy seemed genuine, even if his proposed solution was catastrophic. Then we make sure Tommy gets his treatment, came firmly, but we do it legally, ethically, and in a way that protects him and every other child from future theft. Ryan closed the notebook and looked directly at me for the first time in months. You're going to turn me in. We're going to turn you in, together. Tomorrow morning, we're meeting with Sarah Chen and hospital administration. You're going to confess everything, provide complete documentation of every theft, and commit to full restitution and treatment. The silence stretched between us like a bridge that could either connect us or collapse entirely. Ryan's internal struggle was visible, the part of him that wanted redemption warring with the addicted part that saw only catastrophe and accountability. What if there's no coming back from this? What if addiction treatment doesn't work, or the families can't forgive me, or the criminal charges destroy any chance of rebuilding our life together? His questions were valid, heartbreaking, and completely beside the point. Then we face those consequences together, honestly, instead of building our future on more lies and stolen money. Ryan opened his notebook one final time, not to the planning pages or the calculations, but to a section near the back filled with letters he'd apparently written but never sent. Letters to Tommy's parents apologizing for delays in his treatment, letters to Emma Chen's family explaining why her surgery had been postponed, letters to every affected family accepting responsibility and begging for forgiveness. "I wrote these after every theft," he said quietly. "Part of me always knew this day would come." The letters were heartbreaking in their sincerity and devastating in their implications. Ryan had been carrying the full weight of his actions, documenting not just the financial damage, but the emotional cost to families who trusted our hospital with their children's lives.
"There's one more thing I need to tell you," Ryan said, reaching for his phone. "Something that changes the timeline for everything." The text message he showed me was from his gambling contact, someone named Marcus, who apparently provided high-stakes investment opportunities for serious players. The message was simple but chilling. "Friday deadline for Rodriguez payment. No extensions. Interest compounds daily after that." Ryan hadn't just been stealing from Tommy's family. He'd been using their treatment money as collateral for gambling debts. And those debts were coming due, with interest rates that suggested his creditors weren't traditional financial institutions. "Ryan, who exactly did you borrow money from?" His silence told me everything. The danger was no longer just financial. It was physical, immediate, and involved people who wouldn't be satisfied with payment plans or apologies. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right despite being terrified of the consequences. The next morning, Ryan and I walked into Children's Hospital together for what we both knew would be our last time as a married couple visiting my workplace. He carried his notebook, the evidence folder Sarah had compiled, and a letter of resignation from all his medical consulting contracts. His hands shook, but his voice was steady when he asked to speak with hospital administration immediately. Sarah had arranged for us to meet with the hospital's chief financial officer, legal counsel, and security director in the main conference room, the same room where we'd celebrated successful fundraisers and honored families whose children had beaten impossible odds. Now it would witness the confession that had kept Ryan awake for months. "Before we begin," Ryan said, placing his notebook on the polished table, "I need you to know that Dr. Chen and my wife had no knowledge of my actions until this week. Everything I'm about to confess was planned and executed entirely by me." His statement was both protection for me and acceptance of full responsibility, something the gambling addiction had prevented him from doing for 18 months. Watching Ryan choose accountability over self-preservation felt like seeing the man I'd married finally emerge from the shadow of his disease. The confession took 3 hours. Ryan detailed every theft, every rationalization, every moment when he'd chosen addiction over the children whose trust he'd violated. But he also provided something unexpected: complete documentation of every affected family, precise amount stolen, and a timeline that would help hospital administration understand exactly which treatments had been delayed or denied because of missing funds. "Tommy Rodriguez's next treatment cycle is scheduled for Monday," Ryan concluded. "His family believes insurance complications are causing delays, but the reality is that I stole his treatment money to cover gambling debts. He cannot wait any longer." The hospital's response was swift and decisive. Security escorted Ryan from the building, while legal counsel contacted law enforcement and the district attorney's office. But they also did something that surprised me. They immediately authorized emergency funding to cover all delayed treatments, ensuring that no child would suffer additional delays while the investigation proceeded. That afternoon, while Ryan was being processed at the county jail, Sarah and her team began the delicate work of contacting affected families. Rather than simply explaining the theft, they focused on solutions. Treatments would proceed as scheduled, all stolen funds would be restored, and additional support services would be provided to families who'd experienced stress and delays because of Ryan's actions. The Rodriguez family's response broke my heart
and restored my faith simultaneously. Tommy's mother, exhausted from weeks of worry about insurance complications, simply asked, "Will Tommy get his treatment on Monday?" When assured that he would, she added, "Then we'll pray for whoever was struggling enough to make this mistake. God knows we've all made choices we regret when we're scared." Her grace was humbling and heartbreaking. This woman, whose 7-year-old son was fighting for his life, chose compassion over anger when learning that someone had stolen from her child's medical fund. Her response reminded me why pediatric nursing was more than a profession. It was a calling to serve families whose strength often exceeded our own. The media attention was inevitable but manageable. Hospital administration framed the story around their immediate response and commitment to affected families rather than the scandal itself. Ryan's cooperation with the investigation and his comprehensive documentation actually helped expedite restitution and minimize long-term damage to families' treatment plans. 3 days later, Tommy Rodriguez received his scheduled treatment. Emma Chen's surgery proceeded without further delays. Every affected family had their stolen funds restored and their children's care resumed according to original medical timelines. Ryan's healing would take much longer, but the children's healing could finally continue. 6 months later, healing had taken root in unexpected places. Tommy Rodriguez was in remission, his laughter echoing through the pediatric ward as he taught other children to draw superheroes. His mother still brought homemade cookies to the nursing staff, now also volunteering with families newly navigating childhood cancer. Emma Chen had survived her brain tumor surgery and returned to creating art that filled our hospital walls with butterflies. Her family established a small scholarship fund for children pursuing creative arts during extended hospital stays. Ryan was serving his sentence while participating in intensive gambling addiction treatment. His weekly letters showed genuine remorse and detailed progress from counseling sessions. "The hardest part isn't accepting what I did," he'd written recently. "It's learning to forgive myself enough to become someone worthy of making amends."
Sarah Chen had become more than a colleague. She'd become a dear friend whose partnership in protecting patients had evolved into something deeper. We started having Sunday morning coffee together, talking about hospital improvements and dreams of expanding pediatric care throughout Oregon. The hospital implemented new safeguards, but more importantly, they created a family support fund using my aunt's inheritance as the foundation. Sarah's legacy was finally fulfilling its intended purpose, ensuring no child's treatment would ever be delayed because of financial complications. Mom called every Sunday evening, just as she had since college. Now our conversations included updates about Ryan's progress and discussions about forgiveness and second chances. "Your grandmother always said, 'The strongest people aren't those who never fall down,'" she reminded me recently. "They're the ones who get back up and help others do the same." The divorce papers had been quietly withdrawn, replaced by separation agreements, allowing both Ryan and me space to heal individually while keeping doors open for whatever our future might hold. Some marriages survive through love alone. Others require love, plus time, accountability, and the hard work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. 3 weeks ago, Ryan called from treatment to tell me about a letter he'd received from Tommy's family. They'd written to thank him for his cooperation in ensuring Tommy got proper treatment and to let him know they were praying for his recovery too. Their grace had moved him to tears and motivated him to volunteer as a peer counselor for other inmates struggling with addiction. Sometimes protecting your assets means protecting your heart, and sometimes the greatest inheritance is learning that healing others helps heal yourself. The children were safe, the families were whole, and slowly, carefully, we were all learning to trust again.